Right. So at this point, you're probably wondering how a museum can afford to pay for a project like this. And the good news is there are several funding options available out there, and I'm going to talk about one such option, the digital access to heritage component of the museum's assistance program. So I have that open on my computer right here, which we will transition over to now, and I'll take you through some of its key criteria and requirements. The main purpose of the digital access to heritage component is to build your museum's capacity to showcase digital content and improve access to its heritage collections through digital means. So that can be anything from digitizing an existing physical collection, sharing a digital collection that you already have, creating a digital exhibit using either physical or digital content, or indeed sharing and developing best practices in digital content development and digitization, and even sharing them with other museums. It doesn't actually even need to be just your museum that can benefit from this exercise. So up front, of course, we'll want to make note of the application deadlines, since that's pretty important. Uh, as of the time of filming, February 10th, the closest deadline is coming up pretty soon. It's March 1st, 2022. But thankfully, we have another one that's a little further out now at September 1st, 2022. So that can give you a bit more time to come up with your project idea and get your application in. Either way, though, it is important to note that regardless of which deadline you submit your application for, all project applications can only run up until March 31st, 2024. So if you think of a digital project that's going beyond that point, you're doing so on your own funds and at your own risk. So eligible types of organizations for this type of funding would include some of the following: an Indigenous governing body or organization with a mandate that focuses on preserving Indigenous heritage. The next option would be most of us, I would think, an incorporated nonprofit Canadian museum, which A, provides service to the public all year, B, employs at least one full-time staff member, C, has written policies for its main museum functions, and D, has a current 3 to 5 year strategic business plan. On that last point, I realized that strategic planning is not exactly one of the main priorities we all had in mind when we were concerned about keeping ourselves afloat during this pandemic. But it is standard museum practice to have a strategic plan on the go at all times, and the Canadian government is looking for that when they're considering funding applications. So if you haven't got one in play right now, I would suggest sitting down with your board or whoever's responsible for coming up with such a plan and drafting it out in full so that you could submit it with your application. Somewhat similarly, you could also be an incorporated nonprofit Canadian museum without a permanent physical space. So you could be, say, a virtual museum, which, digital access to heritage component, that just makes sense, right? Now, the same sort of criteria would apply in that scenario. You'd have to be open to the public year-round, whether that's in person or online. You have to be in continuous operation for at least 2 years. So this can't just be some sort of immediate startup. You have to be a sort of established institution, if you will. Needs at least one full-time staff, policies for relevant museum functions, and of course the 3 to 5 year strategic plan. Last but not least, you could be a museums association or incorporated nonprofit Canadian service organization with membership relating to the museum sector. That again is open year-round, has at least one full-time staff, and the strategic business plan. As it turns out, Canadian Heritage has put a lot of funding on the table for this component, and there's a lot of expenses that they're willing to cover for this type of project, namely prorated salaries and wages for contract staff that you might be able to hire for the project. They've also offered coverage for travel expenses, consulting expenses, equipment and administration, evaluation of project results, translation of the project material, including both English, French, and Indigenous languages, minor capital asset costs like computers, scanners, cameras, and other such equipment up to $50,000, other materials and supplies for the development of tools and documents for museum professionals, say if you're doing a sharing of best practices type of project, and even project audit fees if those should apply. Generally speaking, project funding under the Digital Access to Heritage component will not normally be over 70% of the eligible expenses that you can submit as part of your application. In exceptional circumstances, though, they can go up to 85%, although there has to be some sort of exceptional circumstance, such as your project benefiting a remote or rural community, or targeting an underserved community, such as an Indigenous community, an ethnocultural or racialized community, official language minority group, LGBTQ2+ community, youth, and so on. The maximum funding they're offering per fiscal year is $300,000, and projects must be completed by March 31st, 2024. So that spans a total of 3 government fiscal years, bringing the maximum funding available per project to $900,000, which is incredibly substantial. Unfortunately, it is not yet possible to submit applications for the Digital Access to Heritage component through the new Canadian Heritage Funding Portal. So applications have to be sought out and submitted the old-fashioned way. So you'll have to contact a representative at your regional Canadian Heritage office, and once you get in touch with them, they will put together and send you the application package, which you would then fill out and submit back to them by email by the corresponding deadline. So once you've completed and sent in your application package, the standard decision period for an application under this component is 18 weeks. So as you are designing and structuring your project and when it is going to begin, I strongly recommend that you place the official project start date sometime around 18 weeks after the application deadline. Otherwise, anything you start on your project may be at your own risk, since you won't potentially have any funding for it yet. It is important to note that there are some official language requirements that would be set out in your application and in your funding agreement, and in general, it is a good idea to structure your project in such a way that the final products will generate content in both English and French to better serve all museum visitors. Equally, it is also important to remember that you're required to publicly acknowledge in both English and French the financial support that you receive from Canadian Heritage through the Museums Assistance Program. And you can do that through a number of means, namely your social media, marketing pamphlets, the exhibit or product itself, any number of means for that matter. And you'll also notice that there is a link here on a guide to the public acknowledgement of financial support if you should have any questions or concerns about that. Last but not least, since Canadian Heritage has offices across the country, you'll want to email them at this general email address here or contact them at one of these 2 phone numbers to get in touch with your local Canadian Heritage office and ask them to send an application package to you so you can begin this process. Thank you very much for watching this presentation today, and please feel free to contact me, Sam Richardson, at sam@ontrmuseum.ca if you should have any further questions.